One Piece is very long, literal decades at this point, almost 30 years, but how long has Luffy actually been on his journey in universe? Have you ever thought about that? Like, would you believe it if I told you that Luffy became an Emperor of the Sea only a couple of months after setting sail again? Or that the 2-year time skip is actually more than 4 times the rest of the series combined? What I want to do with you today is track Luffy's journey day by day as closely as we can, taking in every piece of evidence from dialogue to the actual phases of the moon that we see in the background to see exactly how long One Piece has taken so far in the actual One Piece world. And let's start, of course, from the very day that Luffy departs from Fuchsia Village. Immediately after setting sail, Luffy gets sucked into a giant whirlpool, hides in a barrel, and then pops out and rescues Kobe. And I really hope that he would have only been in that barrel for a couple of hours at most, because surely he would have just run out of oxygen otherwise, right? He then spends a day in Shell Town picking up Zoro, another day in Orange Town beating up Buggy, and one more day on the Islands of Rare Animals hanging out with the canonically best One Piece character, Gaimon. But already here, we start running into a real problem with trying to map out the exact length of Luffy's journey. You might not know this, but Oda rarely actually gives us an exact travel time between different islands, so it's very often unknown whether a full day has passed at sea or entire weeks or even months. And on the other side of things, Oda doesn't actually show it being nighttime in the Romance Dawn or Orange Town arcs at all, which kind of means that people could argue that some of the islands even take place on the very same day, but then again, the East Blue is a really big place, and I don't really think it's reasonable to assume that Luffy and Zoro had that kind of crazy light speed on their little, like, dinghy thing here. Also, no, it hasn't been that long yet to get to Syrup Village, because Luffy gets there within a week of beginning his journey, placing those events on day 6 or 7 of when he first set out. And while Syrup Village is not usually celebrated as people's, favorite arc, when it comes to tracking One Piece's timeline, it turns out that Syrup Village is absolutely excellent. For starters, it's our first ever 2-day arc. Luffy stops Kuro's plan overnight, and since it's nighttime, we get the first appearance of this video's real hero, the moon. Oda actually emphasizes the moon in chapter 28, even naming the chapter itself Crescent Moon. And the lunar phases, assuming that they follow the same length as lunar phases in the real world, are one of the best tools for trying to actually specify how many days actually occur between different arcs. At least they are in the beginning of the story before Oda then seems to drop that idea later on, but by noting that this is a waxing crescent moon, we get a frame of reference to track days later on as well. So, setting out from Syrup Village, the crew travels 1 day to Baratie, then spends a day at the Baratie, and while nighttime is not shown here, travel probably takes at least a day to get to Kokoyashi Village to then destroy Arlong Park. Which, of course, takes yet another day. Because that night, they party under the first bright light of a quarter moon, which usually occurs 3.5 to 4 days after a waxing crescent. The crew then leaves Kokoyashi Village and travels 1 or 2 days to Loketown, where they spend the day and then flee from Smoker at night. And as the crew's preparing to finally enter the Grand Line, Luffy has actually only been adventuring for 2 weeks. That is 100 chapters worth of story for 2 weeks of in-story timeline. But if you feel like that's not that much time for, that much content and an entire East Blue saga, then, man, you're gonna love it when we're finally gonna get to Dressrosa. Anyways, the next day, the crew finally hits Reverse Mountain, does their little thing with Laboon, and then heads to Whiskey Peak, all within 1 single day. And that same night, while Zoro's cutting down like 100 guys, we get ourselves a waxing gibbous, placing this arc approximately 4 days after Arlong Park. Then after another day or 2 of travel, the crew finally heads over to Little Garden and heads out that very same day, but Nami starts getting real sick, so they detour towards Drum Island. Then 3 or 4 days later roughly, they meet Wapol and finally get onto Drum Island itself. Now here specifically, one nice hint for it taking roughly 3 to 4 days is that Dr. Correa calls Nami's illness the 5-day disease and notes that, if they'd gotten there a day or two later, she wouldn't have pulled through here. The Drum Island arc itself also takes roughly a day, and the crew seems to leave that very same night that they arrive. And I mean, you'd kind of think that Nami would like, a little bit more bed rest, but they've got an Alabasta to get to, so there's absolutely no time to waste, it seems. Our other hint for how long it's taken is that Oda actually gives us yet another chapter named after a moon phase, which is chapter 152, Full Moon, which should place the departure from Drum Island about 1 week after Whiskey Peak. Now combine that with the next week of travel to get to Alabasta, and the Straw Hats finally arrive at Vivi's homeland at just 1 month into Luffy's journey. And for the record, we do know it takes somewhere between 5 to 7 days because they actually meet Mr. 2 after 5 days, and Zoro mentions that he hasn't eaten in 4 days once they arrive in Alabasta. Okay, first big arc, right? Alabasta has by far the most days in any arc in the story so far. And by that I mean it's 1 week long, half of which is just Luffy sleeping after the battle with Crocodile. Here's the timeline. On day 1, the Straw Hats arrive in Nanohana, and that night they see a waning gibbous moon in chapter 152, placing this chapter roughly a week after the departure from Drum Island. On day 2 of Alabasta, the Straw Hats finally arrive at Yuba, but then head over to Rain Base to confront Crocodile. And on day 3, Operation Utopia commences for a nice long 41 chapter day. And once Luffy then wakes up 3 days later, they celebrate and get ready to head out the next morning under a moon that is still in the waning gibbous phase in chapter 213. Almost a fifth of the story so far. Next up, there is a potential gap in travel time to Jaya, but once the Straw Hats get there, they actually spend 1 night in which Luffy punches Bellamy under a half moon, which should place this within a week of them having left Alabasta. Oh, also I guess this is as good a place as anywhere to acknowledge a very big disclaimer with using the moon phases as a strict marker of time here. You see, my astronomical homies out there know that the phases cycle through repeatedly, so while this could be the next half moon, theoretically, they could have traveled an entire off-panel month in between the moon cycle to just go back to this phase once again. Which I hope you agree doesn't really make sense, but just to point out that this plotting isn't like an exact science and more like the best guesswork we can do based on the evidence presented in the text. But I'm pretty confident that this is actually the time frame because, again, it doesn't make sense for them to just travel for a whole month. Anyways, on Jaya, they didn't have to leave for the Sky Islands the very next morning because the knock-up stream waits for no one. Then we get another 2-day arc within Skypiea, 1 night of which is spent partying with wolves, hitting the Nika pose. The next day, the Straw Hats then already dip, taking a whole bunch of treasure that the Sky Islanders were going to give them anyways. Add a likely couple of days for travel, and that now brings us to 1.5 months since Luffy set out here. The Davy Back fight on Long Ring Longland takes the better part of an afternoon, but their encounter with Admiral Aokiji leaves Robin and Luffy frozen completely solid, meaning that they take another 4 days for defrosting and recuperation. 3 days after they finally leave, they reach Kokoro's lighthouse and she points them towards Water 7. Wow, a whole week into the saga, and they haven't even gotten to Water 7 at this point. Though it does turn out that Water 7 itself is only a 2-day affair. The first night is the climactic battle between Luffy and Usopp, and that same night we see another half moon in chapter 334, which should place this roughly a week after the previous half moon. And then the second night is the sea train ride to Enies Lobby, and the entire Enies Lobby raid takes place within 1 day. Then there's all the travel time back to Water 7, which should take another day or so, and then post Enies Lobby again takes a solid 5 days because construction of the Thousand Sunny was supposed to take a week, but they actually finished 2 days ahead of schedule, which is absolutely insane that they managed to build that giant ship so fast. Props to Frankie, I guess. Which means that we're now 2 months into the journey in total. Next up, Thriller Bark seems like it might actually be the same day that they leave from Water 7 because the crew is still checking out the new features on the ship. And I mean, technically, if we only count when they actually show the day passing or explicitly state it, we can actually squeeze a lot of these arcs into literally taking place on the same day, which kind of seems impossible, but also is fairly funny to think about. I'm gonna be really generous here and say that this is probably like 2 days after Water 7 happens, because once the Straw Hats actually run into Thriller Bark, the whole zombie ordeal occurs over 1 day and 1 night, and there's a big, beautiful full moon in the sky, which would then place this about a week after the events of Luffy versus Usopp on Water 7. But sadly, this is now actually the point where we have to say goodbye to our favorite celestial body, because while it did seem like Oda up to this point was actually very intentionally plotting out the moon phases in the initial arcs of the story, he then just kind of suddenly stops after this one. Like, we will see the moon after this, of course, but it's a lot less frequently and a lot less obvious that Oda has been using it to actually track time. So, the morning after beating Moria, the crew is party wiped by Kuma, and then they sleep through the entire day. The day after that, they party really hard and Brook officially joins the crew, and they depart 2 days later. Then the crew travels another 3 or 4 days to the Red Line, then they meet Kami. They either arrive at Sabaody Archipelago that same day or the next after, but once they do land on Sabaody, it only takes 1 day before they get Kuma'd right out of there again. That makes it now 2 months and 2 weeks into the story so far. Kinda crazy when you really think about it. Then there's the entire bubble travel scene, right? This is actually kind of really hard to estimate. According to Sentomaru, anyone who gets flung by Kuma is said to travel for 3 days and 3 nights, but is this like a really accurate counter, or is it just like an urban legend? Oda himself actually only shows us 1 night for sure passing by as the Straw Hats are in the bubbles, but for now I'm just gonna take Sentomaru's word for it because he seems like a very trustworthy guy. Luffy seems to only be on Amazon Lily for 1 day and 1 night, and according to Grandma Nion's explanation of the travel times through the Calm Belt, it should take 4.5 days roughly for Luffy and Hancock to make it all the way to Impel Down, which now makes it 2 months and 3 weeks. Here, Luffy spends 2 days in Impel Down in Marineford. The first day includes his loss against Magellan, and then he speedruns Ivankov's hormone treatment in just 20 hours. With the other day, Luffy and his new allies then of course battle out of Impel Down and head to Marineford, and then all the crazy events of the entire war of course take place on the same day, the same afternoon most likely. Skip ahead now 2 weeks later, and Luffy returns to Marineford with Rayleigh to ring the Ox Bell, spreading the entire 3 days, 2 years message to his crew around the entire world. And so, having been a crew for a grand total of around 3 months and 1 single week, the entire Straw Hat crew goes on a 2-year time skip, which means that the entire time skip is 8 times longer than Luffy's entire journey up to this point pre-time skip. But if you thought that that was crazy, things truly get insane when you really think about how the most recent crew members like Brook and Frankie were pretty much on the crew for just like a week or 2 before they then got flung into oblivion by Kuma. Like, the dedication that they already have at this point is absolutely crazy. And that now brings us to the post-time skip, where the arcs are getting way longer. But longer arcs, of course, doesn't always mean a longer timeline within the story, as we will see right away, because the return to Sabaody Archipelago arc and all of Fishman Island takes place across 1 single day, with the Straw Hats departing from Fishman Island the next morning. Then the next day and the next night are spent on Punk Hazard, Caesar clowning around I guess. Then the end of Punk Hazard and almost the entire Dressrosa arc take place also across a single day, which again, absolutely crazy. After Dofi's defeat, Luffy then sleeps for 3 full days in Dressrosa, meaning that not only does he sleep off panel for longer than the entire Dressrosa arc, he actually sleeps longer here than the entire rest of the post-time skip saga so far. Then, 5 days after Luffy heads for Zou, Sanji is taken by Pekoms and Beige for the wedding. 2 days after that, Luffy's group then finally makes it to Zou, and at a solid 7 days of sailing, this could be the longest time that the Straw Hats have ever sailed between 2 different places if, you know, we only count the travel times that are actually, like, explicitly stated in the story. And if you've kept count, that means we're now 2 weeks only into the post-timeskip saga. Luffy then spends 2 days on Zou, and on the first night there, my beloved one is back. It's a full moon in chapter 811. I mean, You don't actually see the full moon because it's really cloudy that night, which is kind of good because otherwise the Minks would have all gone absolute beast mode. But it is, a little bit of a nice piece of foreshadowing for the entire Sulong form reveal later on in Whole Cake Island, which, is definitely not about to break the entire timeline or anything like that. Alright, the wedding is now approaching fast, so I'm kind of assuming that it takes Luffy around 5 to 7 days to reach Big Mom's territory, and from an amount of time passed perspective, Whole Cake Island has gotta be my absolute new favorite arc ever. Because it turns out that this arc specifically takes place across not 1, not 2, but 5 days, and we actually get to see every single one of them. Here we go. The first day of Whole Cake Island, Luffy reaches Big Mom's territory, accidentally poisons himself, and then gets a big, really wet and sloppy kiss from Reiju. Once they then actually get into Totland, Luffy spends the entire night fighting Cracker. The day after that finally begins with a very one-sided fight between Luffy and Sanji, and then ends with Sanji bringing Luffy his meal later in the same spot. The next day is Operation Tea Party, and during that same night, Luffy starts fighting with Katakuri for 10 hours through the entire night while the crew starts evading Big Mom. And this night specifically is what really starts to cause a lot of problems for me here figuring out the timeline, because Carrot goes Sulong, which means that very quickly after the last one, in chapter 888, there's already another full moon, which means one of a few things here. Option 1, I was absolutely wrong about it taking a week to get to Whole Cake Island, and it actually took an entire month, which kind of feels, again, weird given the urgency of needing to get there soon enough to stop the entire wedding from happening. Option 2, very fun one, there are multiple moons in the One Piece world, which has been a very long-running theory based on the planetary model we see in the Library of Ohara. Or 3, the moon phases simply take different amounts of times to change, than they do in the real world. Maybe the moon revolves around the One Piece planet faster. But then as you realize, if that's the case, then it would mean that none of the moon phases we were using in the pre-Timeskip arc can actually be reliably counted towards figuring out how much time has passed. Or secret option number 4, when Oda started the series, he actually tried using the moon phases as a very reliable indicator, but once the post-Timeskip saga started hitting, he just kind of abandoned that idea entirely, and the full moons are just kind of like vibe-based and happen whenever he needs some Mink to go Sulong form. Really, there's just no way at this point to really know for sure whether the moon is still a reliable counter for time or not, but if you have a better idea, please let me know in the comments. Anyways, on the final day of Whole Cake Island, Big Mom eats a very delicious cake, the Straw Hats flee, and Big News Morgan spreads the news of the 5th Emperor around the world. At this point, we're 1 month into the post-Timeskip as the Straw Hats escape Big Mom's territory, or if the full moon did take a whole month, then we are at 1 month and 2 weeks. After this, as you know, Luffy finally reaches Wano, where the Straw Hats who have stayed on Zou have already been undercover for around a couple of weeks here. However, being undercover is not Luffy's strong suit, so 1 day later after arriving, Luffy is already defeated by Kaido and thrown into jail in the Udon prison mines. Once Luffy had been on Wano for 5 days, Big Mom catches up, beginning the entire Amnesia plotline, and then 2 days after that, Big Mom liberates the Udon prison, is captured, and taken to Onigashima, where she begins fighting Kaido, and Yasui is also executed. RIP. All of that happens just 1 week into Wano, which gives Luffy and the rest of the anti-Kaido forces about 1 more week to train and then prepare before the final raid on Onigashima. Now, during the raid on Onigashima though, we've got yet another big problem because, yep, figures, there is already yet another full moon. And whereas I used to absolutely love whenever the moon popped up in the story to measure time, now it has me actively pulling my hair out and then ordering Rogaine to, replace the hair I just pulled out. Let's not do that. So for my Moon Piece believers out there, then that means there was a full month between Zou and Whole Cake Island, and then another full month between Whole Cake Island and Wano. That would then put the raid of Onigashima at 2 months and 2 weeks after the initial time skip began, which doesn't feel awful as a timeline, I will say. It still just kind of means that the travel times between Zou and Whole Cake were just a lot longer than I would have ever assumed, and that Whole Cake Island and Wano are just half as close as those two were. Anyways, moving on. After Kaido's defeat, the Straw Hats chill in Wano for another 2 weeks, which is quite long. They kind of deserve the break at this point, to be honest. They really should treat themselves to more downtime on these islands a little bit more often, I think. And that brings the total time for the Wano arc to 1 month, the longest arc in One Piece history, in both senses, both in real world time, which was like over 4 years, and in universe. Which means that we're now at 2 years and 5 months for the entire series after Luffy set out to travel, right, so far, or we can also tack on a little bit extra time for the Moon Believers out there as well. And that now brings us to the current saga. The travel time to Egghead Island is kind of vague again, but it's probably around another week or so. Once they then arrive on Egghead, the whole affair takes a couple of days, with them battling the Gorosei and escaping the very next day. Once they're then rescued by the Giants, they're still at sea 2 days later when everyone realizes that half the Straw Hats are suddenly just missing, having been taken to Elbaph by Rhodes Raven here. But once they wake up, the entire Elbaph arc, at least so far, has been happening over 1 single day again, which makes the final count for the journey right now approximately 2 years, 5 months, and 2 weeks, or we can add another month or so if we can, still count on the moon phases. Again, let me know what you think in the comments about that. And after this arc, I'm pretty sure that Luffy will sleep for another full week at least, bringing the series to a final war, a war sure to be reminiscent of Elbaph's crazy mural, which, in terms of time, has been way, way older, at least 800 years, and it shows history from back probably to at least 3,000 years. If you want to know everything that's depicted here, I break it down in this video. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Please make sure to subscribe to this new channel. Yes, this is not Ohara, and I will hopefully see you in the next video.